Many protesting French farmers remain on the barricades Friday despite calls to unblock the roads. An Ukrainian naval drone successfully attacked a Russian warship near Crimea, according to a video published by Ukrainian officials. U.S. President Joe Biden has approved plans for retaliatory strikes against Iran-backed militants in Iraq and Syria.
An explosion in the Kenyan capital of Nairobi burns through homes, killing at least 3 people.
Many protesting French farmers remain on the barricades Friday despite calls to unblock the roads. Prime Minister Gabriel Attal announced a package of measures that include additional subsidies and permission to use pesticides allowed in other EU countries. Yet, protesters saw some contradictions between Attal's promises and what other ministers have been saying and decided to extend the protest at least into Friday.
Et donc en fait, on est dans l'attente finalement de précisions écrites de la part du gouvernement français pour bien comprendre ce qui a été dit, puisqu'en fait, il semble y avoir eu un peu de décalage entre la prise de parole du Premier ministre et de ses ministres. Donc en fait, on a demandé à ce qu'on nous fournisse des explications, des éléments supplémentaires pour mieux comprendre en fait ce qui a été exprimé.
In areas that have been blocked for several days, farmers offer free cartons of milk to drivers who manage to get through as a form of apology. On Thursday, as EU leaders met for the first summit of the year, protests broke out in Brussels and thousands of farmers gathered to address the summit. European leaders met with protesters' representatives. President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said that farmers can count on European support. In the meantime, farmers in more EU countries are joining the protest. On Thursday, protests broke out in Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal.
The French government's decision to pause the phase-out of some pesticides may have persuaded farmers to end their protests, but it has enraged environmentalists. Paris now says it won't introduce any more bans on pesticides, and it won't outlaw ones that are authorised elsewhere in the European Union. An MP who wrote a parliamentary report recommending restrictions on pesticides disagrees.
Nos conclusions, c'est qu'il y avait urgence à agir. Il y a des impacts très forts sur l'environnement, sur l'eau notamment, sur la fertilité des sols et bien sûr sur la santé humaine. Et les premières victimes, c'est le monde paysan lui-même.
French farmers have long complained that the government's pesticide reduction goals are placing an impossible financial burden on them.
Ils nous enlèvent tellement de produits qu'on va plus pouvoir travailler. Ou alors c'est de l'investissement dans des robots, pour désherber, mais à l'heure d'aujourd'hui, les robots pour désherber, ils ne sont pas forcément encore au point. Et à l'heure d'aujourd'hui, on ne peut plus investir.
The use of pesticides has been linked to a 2/3 collapse in the populations of pollinating insects in farmlands in France. There's also evidence some chemicals may trigger diseases such as Parkinson's. The government's plan had aimed to halve pesticides use by 2030.
The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and other EU leaders, the Belgian and Dutch Prime Ministers Alexander De Croo and Mark Rutte, made an impromptu meeting with farmers' unions on the sidelines of the EU summit in Brussels. Earlier that morning, over 1,000 tractors showed up outside the European Parliament, where angry farmers set bales of hay on fire and toppled a bronze statue. Protesting farmers across Europe demand more income. They're also critical of the EU's Green Deal policy to protect the planet.
We had a very constructive, a very good meeting. We listened to the main complaints and worries and concerns of the farmers. It's very important that we find common solutions. We share the goals, for example, the protection of nature, because we all live in nature and with nature, and the best ambassadors for nature are the farmers themselves.
Farmers also complain about severe administrative burdens brought about by the EU's Common Agricultural Policy. They also complain about low prices for grain and wheat. Prime Minister of Belgium, Alexander De Croo, says the current Belgian EU presidency is putting this issue high on the agenda.
What we see is they want to be a partner in the climate transition. They've done a lot of efforts up to now, but obviously they're confronted with what you could call a lasagna of measures that all come at the same time.
In addition, farmers have concerns about the EU's future trade deals with South America in particular, which according to them will facilitate beef imports from countries with lower regulatory standards. Shona Murray, Euronews, Brussels.
The Ukrainian intelligence service published a video saying it showed an Ukrainian naval drone successfully attacking a Russian warship near Crimea. According to Ukrainian media, Russian search and rescue operations in the area were unsuccessful, implying all crew members died. Moscow has not issued any comments on the incident yet. Officials in Ukraine said Moscow has been refusing to hand over the bodies of those who were on board the transport plane that was shot down near Belgorod, despite Kyiv's demands. The United Nations on Thursday said a recent Russian strike against the Ukrainian city of Kherson hit a humanitarian hub ran by a local NGO, among other targets. Evacuation from frontline settlements in Donetsk resumed due to danger of ongoing fighting and shelling in the area. The evacuation is being conducted by the Proliska Humanitarian Mission, the Humanitarian Fund for Ukraine, and the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. U.S. President Joe Biden has approved plans for retaliatory strikes against Iran-backed militants in Iraq and Syria. No details have been announced except for the preference of good weather for the attacks to prevent civilian casualties. The announcement came in the wake of dozens of attacks against U.S. bases and installations in the Middle East.
We will continue to work to avoid a wider conflict in the region, but we will take all necessary actions to defend the United States, our interests, and our people. And we will respond when we choose, where we choose, and how we choose.
While continuing to support Israel in its war against Hamas, Washington on Thursday announced sanctions against 4 Israeli settlers who were accused of assaulting and intimidating Palestinians. The sanctions will freeze the individuals' assets in the U.S. and restrict financial dealings with them. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is expected to deteriorate even more as the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees announced it might have to halt operations completely after this month. The announcement comes after it was discovered that several agency workers in Gaza might have assisted Hamas in preparing the October 7th terror attacks on Israel. On Thursday, dozens of Israeli citizens gathered in Ashdod, near the main trading port of Israel, to demand a halt to aid shipments. They used slogans such as "Stop feeding terrorists."
At least 3 people have been confirmed dead and some 270 injured by an explosion in a crowded neighborhood of the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. As rescue crews search the devastated area for survivors, authorities fear the death toll will continue to rise. The first explosion, as a truck delivered gas to a business, triggered more blasts and set off a fire that swept through homes in the Embakasi district. The inferno erupted in the early hours of Friday morning as residents slept in their beds. Witnesses spoke of people fleeing in panic amid concerns that others remained trapped inside buildings. As investigators try to establish the exact cause of the disaster, the proximity of industrial buildings to homes in the area is likely to come under scrutiny, as well as whether building regulations had been strictly enforced.
An unprecedented nationwide strike kicked off on Thursday in Finland. A rally in the capital Helsinki attracted 10,000 workers, according to the police. Trade unions estimate up to 300,000 workers from many sectors could participate in the strikes. Much of the Nordic nation has ground to a halt with transport sectors, planes, trains, ferries and buses out of action today.
Me kilpaillaan maailmanmarkkinoilla ja se, että suomalainen pärjää siellä maailmanmarkkinoilla, suomalainen työ, niin se tarkoittaa siitä, että siinä kilpailussa suomalainen työnantaja, työntekijä ja Suomen valtio on samalla puolella.
Major Finnish trade unions are protesting against government plans to reform labor laws. Among the key issues are significant cuts to social welfare and rewriting the rules of collective bargaining. The government insists the reforms are crucial to keep Finnish economy competitive and sustainable.
Commuters in Germany faced a second day of transport chaos as up to 90,000 public sector workers continued their strike. In most federal states, trains, buses and trams have ground to a halt. Bavaria was not affected, but in all other states, unions are calling for better pay and better working conditions. On Thursday, air travel was also disrupted. More than 1,000 flights were cancelled as security staff striked for better wages. The only airports working normally were those in Bavaria.
Kosovo authorities on Wednesday said they will impose the use of the country's currency, the euro, and abolish the use of the Serbian dinar. This will have most effect in the north of the country, where most of the ethnic Serb minority lives. Kosovo's central bank governor has announced the new rules will come into force as of this Thursday. The decision has sparked concern among Western powers, fearing more tension in Kosovo's relations with Serbia.